From Boyle Heights in Los Angeles, California, Libros, Schmibros Lending Library presents the Latinidad Beyond Borders podcast. Latinidad encompasses the diverse experiences of people who live in Latin America, as well as people of Latin American descent who live in the United States. This podcast explores culture, society, and politics across the Americas through the lens of Latinidad. Welcome to another episode of Latinidad Beyond Borders. I'm your host, Alberto Sahagún. My guest today is Guadalupe Correa-Cabrera. She is professor in the School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. She is also co-director of the Corruption, Networks, and Transnational Crime Research Center at George Mason. She's published numerous books and articles in English and Spanish. In 2017, she published Los Zetas, Inc., Criminal Corporations, Energy, and Civil War in Mexico. More recently, she co-wrote Frontera, A Journey Across the U.S.-Mexico Border, published in 2024. And in May, she has a new book in Spanish, Cartels, Inc. Welcome to the show, Guadalupe.
Thank you very much, Alberto. It's a pleasure to be here and to connect with your audience.
Thank you so much. And Guadalupe is joining us from Mexico City, where she's been a visiting scholar at the UNAM. So there was global headlines back in February 22nd, when the head of the Jalisco Nuevo Generación cartel, known as El Mencho, was killed by Mexican security forces in this operation. And in retaliation, we saw property damage across several states in Mexico launched by the cartel, and also attacks on security forces. So that day, there was a lot of violence across the country, but it didn't continue to that level. But that grabbed international headlines, which the Mexican government did not like. So I want to put this into its broader historical context. So you've focused on researching Mexican cartels, how they're organized, how they operate, how they've developed and evolved over time. So paint us the big picture of how Mexican cartels have developed over the last 20, 30 years, how they've changed, and the different things that they do now.
Of course, Alberto, thank you for the question. It's a very important one. I was born and raised in Mexico, and my family lives in Mexico. So I have somewhat close connection with the dynamics of violence in the country, connected with the so-called drug cartels. In the United States, and particularly today, we're thinking about violence in Latin America overall, but particularly in Mexico, connected with these entities, so-called cartels, right? These very powerful, or at least in the imaginary or in the streaming platforms like Netflix and Telemundo and all those platforms and Hollywood movies, Sicario. Like everything is like a Sicario movie, right? You have bad Mexican people, very powerful guys, very powerful organizations led by powerful, bad-looking guys, Mexican, always looking very Mexican. And that it's exactly what Netflix series represent, Narcos, like series of Narcos or El Chapo. And that is kind of what we at the media represents as, the origins of violence, not only in the country, the border, along the border, and in different places in Latin America. That's all connected with the idea that we had in the past century, particularly in the 1990s of Colombia, and the role of U.S. agencies are going after the bad guys. We have a story of good guys and after bad guys. This idea of a cartel that is formed by, as I mentioned, these very powerful organizations that sometimes even fight for the monopoly of the legitimate use of violence in our countries. that are so powerful, that are, have access to high caliber weapons, to, military strategy, and they can do many things. They have diversified to an extent that it's not only about drug trafficking, but it's also about human smuggling, human trafficking, fuel smuggling, the huachicoleo fiscal, everything. They do very bad things. Kidnapping, extortion, all type of things are, are planned in the head of one bad guy. As I say, like most of them are brown, looking like me, and that we need to take the military there, and we are not capable of doing that because in Mexico and other countries of Latin America, corruption is so big that we need the support of the United States military forces. The anti-cartel strategy, the national security strategy, focused on the Western Hemisphere, going against the bad guys. We have been having a history after the declaration of the war on drugs by Richard Nixon in the previous century. We had this idea that we have to go after the bad guys. So we're going to finish with the problem. And the United States, it's a war of the United States, originated in the United States and imposed upon other countries of Latin America because of the existence of these bad people. That is the social, the media and the streaming platforms and all sorts of media outlets, formal and informal, blogs, the social media will have this same idea. This has been socialized. We are talking about powerful cartels that mainly have to do with drugs. And in order to finish with them, we have to finish with the head because they are so powerful and they send very bad, instructions, and they are protected by these very powerful and bad politicians, right? And everything has been investigated in the United States. So the Department of Justice, the DEA, and the U.S. judges judge these bad guys, and then everything stays the same. So the same strategy, the kingpin strategy, this idea of going after the heads of the cartels, it's a failed strategy because we know that you always need more military, more training, more arms, because these guys are so powerful that even though you get the heads, another head appears, and this is a problem that will never end. Why continuing with this? Anyway, those are the cartels, how they have evolved. In reality, things operate in a very different way. That's the idea that we have of what it's called the cartels, that is being manufactured in the United States of America in the framework of a war on drugs. So these narratives have been manufactured within the same security agencies, particularly connected to the Department of Justice, but now they are, pushed forward by the so-called Department of War in this administration. The reality is that we did talk about drug trafficking organizations. Of course, in a market when there is prohibition, you have, few enterprises that, that control certain spaces. And in the case of illicit markets, it's not like a real cartel, like the OPEC or like Big Pharma. Big Pharma, by the way, it's a real drug cartel. The biggest and the only one that I can see, to be honest, in reality. Big Pharma is the biggest and only drug cartel that exists. Few, very small number of very big and powerful enterprises that connected together dominate the market and operate as a monopoly. That is the cartel. What we see in drug trafficking and within the criminal world is so complex that we have nothing like that. Cartels, as my friend and colleague Osvaldo Zavala has written in this very controversial book because of the title mainly, Cartels Do Not Exist, is real. It is real. The only drug cartel that exists is Big Pharma or OPEC, for example. That's another cartel. So we saw in the 1980s, 1990s, different dynamics at first, connected the actors in Colombia with the drug trade that went through the Gulf to Miami, and then enforcement changed the routes and Mexico became involved in the transportation of drugs from Colombia, particularly cocaine, into Mexico, marijuana. The production has changed, routes have changed, capacities have changed, and Mexicans became big players because they not only transported cocaine, but also started to produce drugs in the territory. That's kind of the general story. And we was talking about drugs. And drugs were centralized, the manufacture of drugs and the transportation with these groups that were so-called drug trafficking organizations. Now we call them cartels. But because of geopolitical, political dynamics, transition of democracy, very complex dynamics in the 1990s, beginning of the 20th century, the end of the Cold War, and the arrival of the United States as an hegemonic power, NAFTA, and this transition towards democracy, this double transition towards democracy and free markets, we had a very different ecosystem operating, right? And so we had connections of these criminal groups or these organizations that dedicate themselves to drugs with different politicians. We had a single party state regime in Mexico with the PRI, more or less centralizing the capacities and, managing drug trafficking business. And then we saw like a drug the so-called drug wars that had to do with the transition towards democracy and different alignments between the actors that dedicated first only to drug trafficking with different politicians and people and candidates that wanted to govern the country. But then at the same time, there was a different model that incorporated military strategy to drug trafficking that enabled these organizations to control territories and then perpetrate other crimes. And so the diversification of criminal activities came with the militarization of the model with the arrival of Los Zetas. And that model changed the whole face of drug trafficking or organized crime, I would say, in the hemisphere because of the incorporation of military strategy into the model of the so-called cartels. So these organizations started to control the territory, bribe the politicians, and then started to dominate everything that was in the territory, right? Licit and illicit activities, particularly illicit activities. They started to charge extortion fees, kidnapping. They started to get involved in human smuggling, human trafficking, other businesses, and that had to do with energy and everything else. But at the same time, something happened. The United States they had been pressuring the Latin American governments through the DEA. Drug policy in the United States seems to be not only about drugs, but about territorial control. In reality, the U.S. drug policy has been a big failure because drugs continue entering the United States. But the presence of the agencies is larger in the hemisphere, right? You have the DEA agency, agents, everybody going after drugs, everybody going after the cartels, but drugs continue entering, and we have a drug addiction crisis in the United States that the president today called fentanyl crisis, others called in the past the opioid epidemic, and drug epidemic in the United States is in reality. But anyway, the focus has been on these bad cartels, that these bad cartels had also transformed themselves. They have evolved into, militarized organizations that adapt and they have capacity to control territories. But at the same time, there is the imposition of the war on drugs, and Mexico accepted that supposedly because they wanted to do that, because they recognized the responsibility. The President Felipe Calderón Hinojosa declared a war on drugs, and then the militarization of drug policy in the Americas operated by Latin American governments, of course, with the advice like the Merida Initiative, CARSI, and Plan Colombia, supported by training, by equipment of the United States, by some resources, of course, by arms that were sold to the army and to the bad people by the arm manufacturing companies. But anyway, this militarization of the criminal model, plus the militarization of the security strategies in the hemisphere, I'm talking about Mexico, I'm talking about Guatemala, Colombia, Ecuador today, you name it, because you don't need anymore the certification, but the countries themselves took over that responsibility of sending the military to fight a problem that they per se militarizing the strategy. They generated other very complicated dynamics in the in the criminal world. So you break many of the organizations that operated at some point and just dedicated themselves to drugs and became powerful. I'm talking about the Gulf Cartel, the Sinaloa Cartel, the Ventral Leyva Brothers, the Juarez Cartel, the Tijuana Cartel, you break them and you start to have smaller organizations operating in the same territory, but also armed and having this mindset of militarization. I mean, the military strategies in their model, and they dedicate themselves to. They start to specialize either in fuel smuggling or in extortion or in kidnapping. So you create a complex adaptive system. And this complex adaptive system adapts to realities, to demand and supply. Now they do what you call, and then what you call fiscal, connect with different actors. Not only are bad guys, like the ones that you see in Narcos or Sicario. In order for you to operate locally, you need to have political protection at many levels, because as we know, the military is involved in the anti-organized crime, anti-narcotics operations. So you have political protection of different forces. You have connections with corrupt officials, but also with certain enterprises, corporations that operate at the local level. So you kind of now have a very complex ecosystem and a network of criminal actors. You don't have a cartel. Therefore, the so-called Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, you cannot think with this evolution in the ground that they continue operating like a Narcos series of a Sicarios movie. And what happened going after Mencho is more a spectacle than a reality. We have a very complex reality, a complex adaptive system formed by a very, very sophisticated network of actors that participate at different levels. You have nodes, you have connections, you have the fueling of these system is corruption, impunity, and the capacity of these actors to be able to move the money, to obtain the money and put it and launder the money. That is exactly how cartels have evolved and adapted to a different reality.
Yeah, so El Mencho has been described as the founder and the leader of the Jalisco Nueva Generación. And yes, in the kind of TV movie version, he's the one calling the shots, and he's kind of this CEO, and right, and the idea is you topple him, and then the organization will crumble. And obviously, that's wrong. So how should we actually think about the leadership of these so-called cartels and how power operates?
Well, what experience has shown us is that they don't matter, that the heads of these groups, they are extradited to the United States. The Department of Justice has taken the information, and then there's another narco, and there's a politician, and now Ruben Rocha Moya, the governor of the state of Sinaloa, these bad guys, Genaro Garcia Luna, the head of the Secretary of Public Safety in Mexico with Felipe Calderon, the president that declared war on drugs. The Mexicans and Latin Americans, very corrupt people, so we need the Department of War because we cannot deal with our bad hombres. Well, I'm just like, I'm just deviating myself from the explanation. But we cannot think about El Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación led by El Mencho. El Mencho, a man that has been, supposedly in the picture, leading an organization that's so sophisticated, has presence everywhere. And not only that, they have presence transnationally because they also move drugs to Europe. And they also connect with I don't remember if Los Choneos or Los Lobos or both. Because some of them, Los Chapitos y El Mallito Flaco and all these, the Mayos, the Chapos, they represent themselves like guys. And then appear like a lot of relatives parading, right? Even El Quintero, El Pelos Chinos, it's his nephew. It's all like, a Netflix series. You cannot, how does this operate? Supposedly it has the heart in Jalisco. El de Jalisco New Generation Cartel, right? Jalisco, Nayarit, Sinaloa, because they have control. In Sinaloa, it's the Sinaloa cartel, but In the Pacific, you have presence of this group, but how you can explain that El Mencho sends the orders to some of these groups that, kidnap or ask for piso in Michoacán, in some parts of Michoacán, the Jalisco Nueva Generación has presence. The Jalisco Nueva Generación has presence in Veracruz. The Jalisco Nueva Generación has presence everywhere, well, not everywhere, in many parts. How can you imagine that these local factions of the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación are led by El Mencho? That's not what happens. There's some other, I would say, cells, criminal cells, that say they are Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación. They use the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación label to extract rents from the people, to say like, I am the cartel. They are armed. They receive political protection. They operate just locally. They have nothing to do with El Mencho. This kind of idea is a centralized organization that is led by El Mencho, just exists in the mindset of the script writers, of the Netflix series, or the movie Sicario. It doesn't happen today. And we have actors that operate in illicit and illicit markets, actors that operate in politics, that go after the narcos. What is the role of the armed forces? And plus, when we talk about cartels, and when we talk about fentanyl as a weapon of mass destruction, we talk about the drug trade in the United States, we should also talk about the distribution of drugs in the United States. And there are no cartels in the United States either, because you can consume drugs freely in the United States. You have distributor of drugs, but that's not a cartel. Those are distributor of drugs. What are the roles of the police at different levels in the United States? How you distribute drugs? Who allows the drugs to enter in the first place? Is El Mallito Flaco, that is like very, very flaco and very, very smart, and that leads the operations of those leaders that operate in Kensington or in Camden or in Skid Row. You have to think about this better. It's a network. And the network has some actors on the Mexican side, have some actors in Colombia, some actors in Venezuela. But that's not only connected with the fentanyl crisis, synthetic drugs, precursors from China. What about the precursors that enter through Canada, where they are produced? How you produce synthetic drugs? Are they only produced in Mexico? In these very unsophisticated labs that it's difficult to understand that they are produced there, or they are also produced in the United States, in labs in the United States, or labs in the United States that produce synthetic drugs do not exist. Breaking Bad is just like a joke. Well, anyway, that is something that we need to think about. What the agencies have told us based on realities, on cases, and but the big picture, the ecosystem, needs to be understood in a different way, and also the organizations themselves.
Right. So this is a complex global network that crosses many borders, and there's no simple solution. There's no simple military solution. But this administration, the U.S. administration, the Trump administration, has been focused on that military strategy. So there's been recent reports about the CIA operating in Mexico without the consent of the Mexican government. That's kind of recent breaking news. But yeah, so what information have you heard while in Mexico about these stories, and overall the big picture of how President Sheinbaum is dealing with the U.S. pressure, and what policies are Scheinbaum's based on her belief of how to deal with this problem, and what is she doing because you think the U.S. is pressuring her to do it? Does she in fact not know that the CIA is operating in Mexican soil? What's your take on this?
Well, there are many questions, right? And there's a lot to talk about this. But to summarize what has been happening, we know that the CIA with undercover operations has always acted in the Western Hemisphere. That's a reality. It's not something new. Which is interesting is that now all these filtrations through the mainstream media tell us that the CIA is in Mexico. It's in Venezuela. It's in Cuba. It's everywhere, right? That kind of like I mean, takes attention, like makes it spectacle more like credible, not that spectacle, but I would say like highlights the presence of the agency, this agency that we should be fearful of, right? Well, the participation of this of agencies of intelligence, of the KGB, for example, or the Russian, or it's always silent. But here, purposely, we know that they are there. And it was very interesting when the CIA agents had an accident in Mexico, and then the U.S. agents were CIA agents. The first pieces of information that we received were from Luis. I mean, one second, I forgot his last name. This, journalists, bloggers, influencers, I would say like journalists that received infiltration, right? And then, it's very interesting how this goes. So, I mean, the Mexican government has always been surprised by all these things and have to react. Claudia Sheinbaum is reacting the way that her ideological project makes her to react, right? She talks about sovereignty. Also she wants to protect certain spaces of decisions, and but overall, Mexico has very little to do here. The asymmetries with the United States are so huge that most of the time, wanting or not, declaring a war on drugs in the name of the United States, like Felipe Calderon, or sending dozens of people to the United States so they could give information. So the information is being used to get the former president. I'm saying something, or the governor of now Sonora or Tamaulipas or whatever, all that, or in order to judge them, because the information is there, the alleged, the investigations by the DEA, like the one of Salvador Cienfuegos, the former head of the Department of Defense. It feeds the narrative that Mexicans cannot deal with their bad hombres because they are involved with the bad hombres. So we need to tend the whatever Claudia does. Claudia is like, oh no, this is bad. We didn't know. It's bad that the governor of Chihuahua was working with the CIA agents. What the CIA agents? I mean, there are many questions that we will have to think about when thinking about this particular super huge narco lab. I'm going into many directions here. What I want to say is that Claudia Sheinbaum is, as any other president of Mexico, reacting very fast, without a lot of information, to what the U.S. agencies and media is telling her to react to. And the reality in Mexico is that there is a lot of corruption and impunity taking place. We don't know if this is connected to drug trafficking, but it's a reality. Many of these politicians cannot prove the incomes that they have been receiving in their positions. Is it because they are connected to Del Mayito Flaco, un chapito that stays in Mexico? Or is it because they cannot justify themselves because of the political protection they give to all types of criminal groups, not just the Cartel de Sinaloa, del Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, but all these groups that operate in the ground that receive their political protection? Maybe it's both, but the United States has like geopolitical goals today, when their role is going down with a national security strategy. The United States wants to take back the Western Hemisphere and expel the influence from China. There's more things than the apparent language of Claudia Sheinbaum and of Donald Trump. The United States needs to take out the influence from China, and the national security strategy specifies, and the Dawn and the Monroe Doctrine, the Monroe Doctrine Reloaded, the Trump Corollarium, tells us to some extent what the United States wants: reestablish control over the Western Hemisphere. They used to have it before the involvement of mainly China in the Western Hemisphere.
And just one final question, if I may. It's kind of a big question, but I just want to kind of allow you to give kind of an outline about how in Mexico they can properly deal with this problem, because security is a problem, right? And a lot of lives of Mexicans have been hurt from these organizations. And yeah, there isn't a simple solution. There definitely isn't a simple military solution. But what are other things that should be done in Mexico to deal with this problem that isn't just about deploying the military?
It's a question that seems to be very complex, but it's a question that has been answered several times, and many people have worked to arrive to a strategy that works, multidimensional, like binational, like that incorporates also transnational actors. And I'm just giving an example. The bicentennial framework was putting on paper that dealt with the different dimensions that we have to deal with. There is a part of enforcement, of course. The simple military solution, I'm against the military solution because I know what it causes in the complex adaptive system networks and the military strategy. But enforcement is important, going after corruption, impunity, yeah, like having, real actions, because we have it on paper, the anti-money laundering actions or the strategy to fight money laundering. And, the consumption of drugs in the United States, dealing with this problem as a problem of public health in the United States. Mexico has to deal with their problem of addiction, corruption, impunity, and the communities also can help with matters of, um, citizen security strategies. It has been all laid out, the strategy, not just I think that the summary in the bicentennial framework, that was a framework, entendimiento bicentenario, which means that there's an understanding by both nations that many things have to be done at the same time, that you have to deal with the root causes of addiction, you have to deal with the root causes, poverty and inequality, that makes the people to be recruited by these criminal organizations, not cartels. All of them are killers, like in the Netflix series, but they do belong to criminal groups that cause a lot of damage, that commit extortion, kidnap people, like, and all that extortion industry generates a lot of people dead. This has to be multidimensional. Like, this is not rocket science. It was all written. It has always been discussed, political will and a real fight against corruption and impunity on both sides of the border. Because if this happens, it's because drugs are distributed in the United States, problems are generated in the United States. What about arms? Arms are produced in the States, but Mexico does not guard well their customs. The same thing with the United States. You don't want drugs? Well, okay, don't allow the drugs to be distributed or enter into your country, right? Are we going to go after the ones who produce it, or are we going to go after the people that demand arms or drugs in the case of the United States or Mexico? So, yeah, the solution is complex, but the solution is there. We have figured out, we know what it takes to solve the problem, but it's easier for politicians. It's easier for the companies. Well, not easier. It's very profitable for the companies that form the military-industrial complex to have a war that can never be won, that reproduces itself and continues selling, equipment, arms. And, it's not that it's not going to be solved, but the companies need to be held accountable, and the banks need to be held accountable. Arms producing firms need to be held accountable. Firms and banks need to be held accountable. Are we going to be able to do that? Are the politicians that are going to receive money during campaigns are going to work for them and not for the people, through the lobbies and lobbies that represent the interests of only few people? We need to start communicating that, and we need to start to make conscience, and there needs to be political will to solve these problems.
Yes, thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.